The morning of June 19, 1944 began the way so many mornings in the Pacific had begun, with the smell of aviation fuel, the groan of hydraulic elevators, and the controlled chaos of a carrier deck preparing to launch. Aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, the newest and most powerful flat-top in the Imperial Navy, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge and watched his aircraft rise into the pale sky. He had every reason to feel confident. He commanded 9 carriers, 5 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 28 destroyers, the largest Japanese carrier force assembled since Midway. His pilots were young, many of them, newer to combat than the veterans who had swept through the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. But Ozawa believed they were ready. More importantly, he believed the Americans were not ready for him. If you've been here before, you already know this channel is dedicated to the stories history almost forgot, the ones that cut closest to the bone. If you're new, consider subscribing now so you don't miss what comes next. The plan Ozawa had built his confidence around was called the Ego Operation. It rested on a carefully reasoned set of assumptions about American aggressiveness, American coordination, and most critically, the quality of American airmen. Japanese naval doctrine had spent years building a picture of the American pilot, and that picture was specific. The American flyer, according to Imperial Navy intelligence assessments, was technically capable but psychologically fragile. He had good equipment and good training, but he lacked the spiritual depth, the sation, the fighting spirit that Japanese commanders believed was the decisive variable in aerial combat. He would press an attack when the odds favored him, the thinking went, but he would hesitate when things got difficult. He would break when pushed hard enough. These were not idle prejudices. They were institutional conclusions, built over years of observation, reinforced by the disasters American aviation had suffered in the early months of the war, and ratified by the deaths of hundreds of American pilots who had thrown themselves at Japanese carriers and accomplished almost nothing. The men who had flown TBD Devastators at Midway, slow, undergunned, obsolete torpedo bombers, had been massacred almost to the last aircraft. The B-17 crews who had bombed from high altitude and scored no hits at all. The Marine pilots in their ancient Brewster Buffaloes, cut apart by zeros in the opening minutes of the Midway battle. The evidence, if you chose to read it a certain way, supported the Japanese conclusion. What Ozawa did not know, what his intelligence officers had failed to tell him, or perhaps had failed to discover for themselves, was that the Americans he was flying against in June of 1944 were not the Americans of 1942. They were something new, something his assumptions had not accounted for and his doctrine had not prepared him to face. By 10 o'clock that morning, the sky above the Philippine Sea would tell him everything. To understand what Japanese commanders believed about American pilots, you have to begin not with the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but with the years before it, the long formative period in which the Imperial Japanese Navy built its understanding of what an enemy aviator was and what he was worth. The Japanese naval aviation program was among the most demanding in the world. In the 1930s, the selection process for carrier pilots was genuinely brutal. Thousands of applicants competed for a handful of training slots. The washout rate was staggering. Pilot Saburo Sakai, who would become one of Japan's most celebrated aces, later recalled that from an initial pool of 1,500 candidates in his class, 70 were selected for flight training, and only 25 ultimately graduated. The Navy was not embarrassed by these numbers. It was proud of them. The philosophy behind this system was coherent, if ultimately catastrophic. Japanese planners had calculated that a small number of superbly trained, spiritually conditioned pilots, men who had been forged through years of hardship, would outperform a larger number of adequately trained ones. Quality over quantity, elite over mass. It was a doctrine that fit Japan's industrial limitations, because producing pilots at American scale was simply not possible for an economy of Japan's size. But it was also a doctrine that fit a deeper cultural preference, a belief that individual excellence and collective spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The proof in the opening months of the war seemed overwhelming. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval aircraft attacked American airfields in the Philippines with devastating precision. General Douglas MacArthur's air forces were caught largely on the ground. In a single strike, Japan destroyed roughly half of the American Far East Air Forces, including 17 of 35 B-17 bombers, the most advanced American aircraft in the theater. The Americans, who had been warned by Washington that war was imminent, had failed to disperse their aircraft or implement basic defensive measures. It was a catastrophe of preparedness, and Japanese commanders noted it carefully. What they observed was not merely a tactical failure but what they interpreted as a characterological one. The Americans had been given time to prepare and had not prepared adequately. They had been surprised despite being warned. This fit the picture that Japanese naval thinking had been assembling for years. The picture had real historical roots. American aviation in the interwar period had suffered from chronic underfunding, divided command, doctrinal confusion, and political neglect. The Navy and Army Air Corps had fought each other as much as they had developed coherent doctrine. Procurement cycles were glacially slow. Aircraft that European and Japanese air forces were retiring as obsolete were still in frontline American service when the war began. The TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, which would be slaughtered at Midway, had first flown in 1935 and was already antiquated by 1941. The Brewster Buffalo fighter, which Marine pilots flew against Zeros at Midway with predictable results, had been rejected by the British and Dutch as unsuitable for combat and sold to the Americans as surplus. Japanese intelligence officers knew this. They tracked American procurement with reasonable accuracy. They measured the performance gap between American and Japanese aircraft and found it satisfying. But they were measuring hardware. What they struggled to measure, what the nature of pre-war intelligence work made difficult to assess, was the human variable. Not just how American pilots flew, but why they fought, what they were willing to endure, and how they adapted when their equipment let them down and their friends died around them. The first real data came at a cost. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 was, in one crucial sense, exactly what Japanese commanders had predicted. American torpedo bombers attacked in suicidal waves and were annihilated. Of 41 carrier-based torpedo aircraft that attacked the Kido Butai on the morning of June 4, 35 were shot down. 0 hits were scored. The performance of the TBD Devastator confirmed every calculation about the inadequacy of American equipment. The bravery of the pilots who flew those aircraft, men who pressed their attacks knowing they were flying into certain death, was noted by some Japanese observers, but it did not substantially revise the institutional assessment. What revised it were the dive bombers that arrived minutes later. The destruction of 3 Japanese fleet carriers in 5 minutes was not supposed to happen. It was not part of any Japanese scenario. The planning war games conducted aboard the battleship Yamato had explored American counterattacks and found them manageable. The American carrier force was real, it was dangerous, it had to be destroyed, but it was expected to fight on Japanese terms, to be drawn into an engagement at a time and place of Japan's choosing, to be outmaneuvered by superior tactics and superior pilots and superior fighting spirit. Instead, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had found the Japanese fleet by following the wake of a destroyer, had made the decision to press his attack on nearly empty fuel tanks, and had led his dive bombers down through 20,000 feet of open sky at the exact moment when every Japanese fighter had been drawn down to sea level chasing torpedo planes. The Japanese fighter pilots who had massacred the torpedo squadrons were down at wave height, out of position, out of altitude, and in some cases out of ammunition, when the Dauntless arrived overhead. They could do almost nothing. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, whose flagship Akagi was among the 3 carriers destroyed that morning, was rescued from the burning flight deck and transferred to the cruiser Nagara. He did not issue coherent orders for several hours. Eyewitness accounts describe him as dazed, almost cataleptic, sitting in silence while the Kido Butai disintegrated around him. He had commanded the most powerful carrier force in the world. He had believed it was invincible. The reassessment that followed Midway was painful, partial, and ultimately insufficient. Japanese naval commanders acknowledged the intelligence failure. They acknowledged the scouting gaps. They reformed search procedures, added aircraft, tightened the timing of reconnaissance flights. They acknowledged that the Americans had demonstrated unexpected tactical coordination. The convergence of Enterprise and Yorktown dive bomber squadrons over the Japanese carriers, though unplanned, had been executed with skill and aggression that the planning assumptions had not anticipated. What they did not fundamentally revise was their assessment of American pilots as a class. The reasoning was not irrational, given what they could observe. Midway had been won not by superior Japanese incompetence alone, though that played a role, but by exceptional individual decisions made by exceptional individuals. McCluskey's choice to turn northwest instead of returning to his carrier. Dick Best's recognition that too many aircraft were piling onto Kaga and his decision, with only 2 wingmen, to break away and attack Akagi alone. Leslie leading his squadron in an unarmed dive to show them the target. These were acts of extraordinary individual initiative, the kind of performance that any honest analyst would hesitate to project onto an entire air force. Japanese analysts could tell themselves, and in internal documents many did, that Midway had been won by American luck as much as American skill. The torpedo attacks had failed completely as expected. The dive bombers had arrived at the one moment in the battle when Japanese fighters were out of position, a moment that could not easily be repeated. The Americans had benefited from foreknowledge of Japanese intentions, from code-breaking intelligence that no future operation could assume would be available again. This was not entirely wrong. Midway had required a convergence of factors that would not all be present in every future battle. The question was whether the Japanese assessment of American pilots, as distinct from American intelligence, American luck, or American industrial capacity, had been properly revised. The answer, revealed progressively through the grinding campaign of the Solomon Islands in the second half of 1942 and all of 1943, was no. The Solomons campaign did something to both sides that neither had fully anticipated. It consumed pilots at a rate that no planning assumption had incorporated, and it consumed them unequally. Guadalcanal, where American Marines landed on August 7, 1942, became the pivot point. For 6 months, Japanese and American air power fought for control of the skies above that green and miserable island. The Japanese had an advantage in aircraft range. Their Zeros could reach Guadalcanal from Rabaul, their main base in New Britain 700 miles away. American fighters operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal were defending their own airspace, which gave them the tactical benefit of shorter transit times and the ability to recover damaged aircraft and wounded pilots. The arithmetic of attrition, hidden beneath the daily tallies of aircraft shot down and ships sunk, was running against Japan in a way that Japanese commanders were slow to acknowledge. The fundamental problem was not the quality of Japanese pilots. In 1942, the surviving veterans of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Indian Ocean raids were still flying. Men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Tetsuzo Iwamoto, and Saburo Sakai, pilots of exceptional skill who had accumulated hundreds of combat hours and dozens of aerial victories. In individual engagements, these men were as dangerous as anyone flying in the Pacific. The problem was replacement. When a veteran Japanese pilot was killed over Guadalcanal, he was replaced by a graduate of a training program that had not been designed for the pace of attrition the war was now generating. The program's philosophy, small numbers, long training, extreme selection pressure, had been built for a short, decisive war followed by a negotiated peace that left Japan in control of its new Pacific Empire. It had not been built for what the war had actually become. A prolonged grinding contest of industrial and human resources in which the ability to replace losses mattered as much as the ability to inflict them. American pilot training worked differently. The Army Air Forces and the Naval Aviation Training Command had been expanding since 1940, driven partly by the fall of France and the British experience in the Battle of Britain, which had demonstrated that modern air war consumed pilots faster than peacetime assumptions suggested. By the time the United States entered the war, the training pipeline had already been substantially enlarged. After Pearl Harbor, it was enlarged again and again and again. The numbers that resulted were not comparable to Japanese production. They were not in the same category. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States trained approximately 200,000 military pilots. The Naval Aviation Training Command alone, centered at Pensacola, Florida, and its affiliated bases, was producing pilots at a rate that Japanese planners had not modeled because the model would have required them to contemplate defeat. What Japanese commanders continued to believe, through the Solomons fighting and into 1943, was that this quantitative advantage was offset by qualitative inferiority. More American pilots meant more American pilots to shoot down. The veterans flying Zeros over Guadalcanal were consistently trading favorably, or so the kill claims suggested. Kill claims in aerial combat are notoriously unreliable. Both sides overcounted. But the Japanese overcounting was particularly consequential because it fed directly into strategic planning at the highest levels. The aerial campaign designated Operation Igo, launched in April of 1943 under Admiral Yamamoto's personal direction, illustrated the problem precisely. Yamamoto had come to the Solomons to conduct a major offensive air campaign intended to destroy American air power in the region once and for all. 350 aircraft, nearly the entire frontline strength of Japanese naval aviation in the South Pacific, flew a series of large strikes against Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, and Allied shipping in the surrounding waters. The results, by any objective measure, were modest. American losses were real but manageable. Japanese losses were significant and not manageable. The after-action reports sent to Tokyo told a different story. They claimed massive American losses, dozens of aircraft destroyed on the ground, ships sunk, airfields neutralized. Yamamoto, reviewing these reports, sent a message to Tokyo that has sometimes been read as the last confident statement of Japanese naval aviation's belief in its own supremacy. The results were, he said, magnificent. He was wrong. The reports were wrong. And he would not live to understand how wrong, because 18 days after Igo concluded, American codebreakers intercepted his inspection itinerary, and P-38 fighters from Guadalcanal shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Yamamoto was the one senior Japanese commander who had genuinely understood the danger of American industrial capacity. He had studied in the United States, observed American factories and American people, and carried that knowledge with him as a private and largely unshared anxiety throughout the war. His death removed from Japanese strategic planning the man most capable of forcing an honest reckoning with what the production numbers meant. What replaced him was not a new realism but an accelerating self-deception. By 1943, the aircraft entering American service had fundamentally changed the terms of the argument. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat had been designed in direct response to the Zero. American engineers, examining a Zero that had been captured nearly intact in the Aleutian Islands in June of 1942, force-landed by a pilot killed by ground fire before he could destroy it, had measured every dimension, tested every system, and fed their findings back into the Hellcat's design. The result was not a copy. It was a counter. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, less maneuverable in a slow-turning fight, and in those respects inferior by the metrics Japanese pilots had always used to evaluate enemy aircraft. But it was faster in a dive, better armored, able to absorb extraordinary punishment and keep flying, and equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks that the Zero lacked entirely. A Zero hit by incendiary rounds typically caught fire. A Hellcat hit by the same rounds often did not. More importantly, the Hellcat forced a change in American tactics that negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage. The Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch partly in response to the slaughter of the torpedo squadrons at Midway, had demonstrated that a disciplined pair of fighters working together could protect each other against more maneuverable opponents. The Hellcat, faster and more durable, extended this principle into a comprehensive tactical doctrine. American fighter pilots in Hellcats were taught not to turn with Zeros but to use altitude and speed, to dive, shoot, and climb away before the Zero's maneuverability could be brought to bear. It was a doctrine that required discipline and trust in the aircraft's structural strength. It worked. The Japanese response to the Hellcat was inadequate in ways that revealed the deeper problem. Japanese aircraft development in the middle years of the war was hampered by industrial limitations, doctrinal conservatism, and a persistent belief that the solution to better American aircraft was better Japanese pilots rather than better Japanese aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, which had entered service in 1940 and had been the most advanced carrier fighter in the world at that time, received incremental improvements rather than fundamental redesign. The A6M5, the major production variant of 1943 and 1944, was faster and better armed than its predecessors, but it remained deficient in protection, and it remained unable to match the Hellcat in the kind of high-speed combat that American tactical doctrine was designed to force. New Japanese designs, the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden land-based interceptor, the Kawanishi N1K fighter, showed real capability but were produced in small numbers, plagued by engine problems, and unavailable in the quantities needed to affect the balance. The deeper issue, which Japanese planners were aware of and unable to solve, was that their pilot training program had begun to collapse under the weight of attrition. The men flying Japanese carriers by mid-1944 were not the men who had flown at Midway. The veterans, the pilots who had trained for 2 and 3 years, who had built their skills through hundreds of hours of practice and dozens of real engagements, were mostly dead. Nishizawa would survive until October of 1944, when he was killed not in aerial combat, but as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft shot down by American fighters. Iwamoto would survive the war, one of a dwindling handful. But as a core, as the institutional body of experienced knowledge that had given Japanese naval aviation its edge, the veterans were gone. What replaced them were young men who had completed training programs progressively shortened as the war consumed time, fuel, and instructors. The Navy had begun cutting training hours in 1943, then cut them again in 1944. By the time Ozawa's carriers sortied for the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, many of his pilots had logged fewer than 300 hours of total flight time. Some had significantly less. American pilots entering frontline service at the same period had averaged 525 hours. That gap, 225 hours, represented not just flying time but combat training, instrument proficiency, formation flying, gunnery practice, and the accumulated judgment that comes from having made enough mistakes in training to avoid making them in combat. It represented the difference between a pilot who understood his aircraft and a pilot who was still learning it. Ozawa knew some of this. His staff knew some of this. What they had constructed in the months before the Ego operation was a plan designed to work around the limitation rather than solve it. The plan's central feature was what Japanese planners called the outranging tactic. Japanese carrier aircraft, particularly the new Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei dive bomber and the Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber, had longer range than their American counterparts. Ozawa planned to launch his strikes from beyond the range at which American aircraft could respond, attack the American fleet, and then continue on to land at Guam and Tinian in the Mariana Islands, refuel, and return to their carriers. His pilots would not have to fight their way back through American combat air patrol. The American fighters would not be able to intercept the outbound strike. It was elegant on paper. It assumed his pilots could execute extended navigation flights, find the American fleet, deliver attacks through defensive fire, then navigate again to unfamiliar airfields on islands they had never visited. It assumed, in other words, a level of pilot competence that the training pipeline had not reliably produced. Japanese commanders had known for months that American code-breaking capability posed a threat to operational security. The lesson of Midway, where Japanese communications intercepts had allowed the Americans to position their carriers in ambush, had been absorbed at the doctrinal level. Procedures had been tightened, radio discipline improved, code books changed more frequently. What had not been absorbed was the deeper lesson: that an enemy who read your communications could also read your capabilities, your locations, and your intentions. American signals intelligence by mid-1944 was tracking Japanese fleet movements with a precision that Ozawa's staff would have found incomprehensible if they had known about it. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the American Fifth Fleet, knew Ozawa was coming. He knew approximately when, approximately from where, and approximately with how many aircraft. What he chose to do with this knowledge, the decision to hold position and let Ozawa come to him rather than sortie aggressively, would be criticized after the battle by officers who wanted a more aggressive pursuit. But Spruance's caution was itself a calculation, and it was a calculation built on a correct assessment of what American pilots in American aircraft flying American tactical doctrine could do to Japanese aircraft launched from beyond the range of American counterattack. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 waves. The largest included more than 60 aircraft. What met them was the Hellcat. The radar operators aboard the American carriers had been watching the Japanese aircraft assemble on their screens for nearly an hour before the first wave arrived. American carriers had been equipped with radar since 1942. The technology had improved substantially in the intervening 2 years. By June of 1944, the combat information centers aboard Essex-class carriers could track incoming formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, calculate their speed, altitude, and heading, and vector defending fighters to intercept them with a precision that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who had fought at Midway. The Japanese had no equivalent system. Their carriers had finally received primitive radar installations by mid-1944, but the sets were unreliable, poorly integrated into tactical decision-making, and operated by personnel who had not had time to develop the expertise that American radar operators had accumulated over 2 years of continuous use. Japanese air defense in 1944 still depended primarily on visual lookouts and voice radio nets that were frequently jammed by American electronic countermeasures. This asymmetry, radar against eyes, was not incidental. It was structural. It meant that American fighter directors knew where the Japanese aircraft were at every moment of their approach. It meant that American Hellcats could be positioned at altitude, with energy, waiting for an enemy who did not know they were there until the shooting started. The fighter director aboard the carrier Lexington was Commander Joseph Eggert. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared on his radar screen on the morning of June 19th, he had 12 squadrons of Hellcats orbiting at various altitudes in a layered defensive arrangement. He began vectoring them toward the incoming strike with calm precision, adjusting headings and altitudes as the picture developed on his screen. The Japanese pilots flying that first wave had taken off from Ozawa's carriers in good order. Many of them had never flown a real combat mission. Their training had included formation flying, navigation, and weapons delivery, the basic requirements. What it had not included, in sufficient quantity, was the experience of flying against opponents who were trying to kill them with the full capability of a modern fighter. The Hellcats hit the first wave approximately 70 miles from the American fleet. What followed was not an air battle in the sense that the engagements over Guadalcanal had been air battles. Long, complex, swirling contests in which experience and individual skill determined the outcome of dozens of separate duels spread across miles of sky. What followed was closer to an execution. The Hellcat pilots had altitude, speed, radar guidance, and 2 years of accumulated tactical doctrine that had been specifically engineered to defeat the aircraft they were fighting. They dove into the Japanese formations from above, fired, climbed away, dove again. The Japanese pilots who tried to turn and fight found themselves in slow maneuvering contests that their inexperience made dangerous regardless of aircraft capability. The ones who tried to run found that the Hellcat, faster in level flight and significantly faster in a dive, could catch them. The attrition was not gradual. It was immediate and overwhelming. Of the 69 aircraft in Ozawa's first wave, approximately 42 were destroyed before they reached the American fleet. Of those that broke through, the attacks were poorly coordinated, inaccurately executed, and largely ineffective. A handful of bombs and near misses fell around the outer escort vessels. No fleet carriers were hit. The second wave fared worse. The third wave, attempting to bypass the main defensive screen by approaching from a different angle, flew into a separate group of Hellcats and was similarly mauled. The fourth wave, launched later in the day, found the American Combat Air Patrol positioned and waiting. By the time the last Japanese aircraft had turned back toward Ozawa's carriers or toward Guam, the accounting was staggering. The Americans had destroyed approximately 240 Japanese aircraft in the air. Anti-aircraft fire had accounted for several dozen more. American combat losses were 23 aircraft, many of whose pilots were rescued from the water. A kill ratio exceeding 10-1. Commander David McCampbell, leading the Hellcat squadrons from Essex, personally destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission that day. He would end the war as the United States Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed victories. On June 19, 1944, he was doing what American pilots had been trained and equipped to do: finding the enemy, pressing the attack, and bringing his men home. The phrase that attached itself to the battle came from a radio transmission that day, attributed in various accounts to Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey of VF-16, though the precise origin remains disputed. What the transmission captured was not triumph but something closer to astonishment. The kind of astonishment that comes when something you have prepared for turns out to be even more lopsided than you expected. He called it a turkey shoot. The phrase entered the historical record as the Great Marianas turkey shoot, a name that has sometimes been criticized as flippant given the deaths involved. But the men who used it were not being callous about the Japanese pilots who died. They were expressing their genuine bewilderment at the disparity, at how thoroughly, how completely, how almost effortlessly the outcome had been decided. It was not supposed to be this easy. War was not supposed to be this easy. Something had gone fundamentally wrong on the Japanese side of that equation. The answer was training. It was always training. If you found this story as compelling as I have, share it with someone who loves history, And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. The magnitude of what Japanese naval aviation had lost in the 2 years between Midway and the Philippine Sea becomes comprehensible only when you trace it carefully, engagement by engagement, through the grinding campaign of the Solomons. The fighting around Guadalcanal between August of 1942 and February of 1943 had consumed Japanese air groups at a pace the training system could not sustain. The long-range strikes from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 700 miles each way, at the extreme limit of the Zero's endurance, were costly in ways that extended beyond aircraft shot down. Fuel consumption at those ranges left pilots with minimal reserves for combat maneuvering. Wounded aircraft that might have made it back to a closer base were lost over the open ocean. Wounded pilots who might have survived with prompt medical attention died because rescue at those distances was nearly impossible. Each experienced pilot lost in the Solomons represented not just a fighting asset removed from the order of battle but a body of knowledge that would never be transferred to the training pipeline. The Japanese system had no mechanism for rotating veterans out of combat to serve as instructors. The best pilots flew until they were killed, because the operational demand for their skills was immediate and continuous, and the institutional value of their survival as trainers was never weighed against it. American pilot management worked differently, and the difference was not accidental. It was policy. The Navy had established a rotation system by mid-1942. Pilots who had completed a combat tour were rotated back to training commands, where their experience was used directly, teaching the specific techniques, the tactical lessons, the practical knowledge that no syllabus written before the war could have incorporated. The men who had survived the Solomons and Midway brought with them not just their flight hours but their understanding of what the enemy actually did, how the Zero actually handled in combat, what mistakes cost you your life and what habits kept you alive. This feedback loop was one of the most consequential organizational decisions either side made in the entire Pacific War. By 1943, American flight training was being shaped at every level by combat veterans. The curriculum had been revised based on what those veterans had learned in actual engagements. The tactics manual had been rewritten. The approach to gunnery training had been overhauled after analysis of aerial combat footage revealed that most pilots were opening fire at ranges where hitting a maneuvering target was nearly impossible. Gunnery ranges were extended. Deflection shooting, leading a moving target, was drilled until it became instinctive. Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, who had become the Navy's first ace of the war by shooting down 5 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement in February of 1942, did not spend the rest of the war in combat. He spent part of it as an instructor and planner, helping develop night fighter tactics before returning to combat command. His experience, and the experience of dozens of officers like him, was systematically extracted and fed back into the training system. Japan had no equivalent process. The veterans who survived were too valuable in combat to be spared for training. The training commands received officers who had been wounded out of frontline service, older men who had accumulated experience in an earlier era, and an increasingly thin trickle of combat-experienced pilots as the pool of survivors shrank. The result, by 1943, was a measurable and growing gap in the quality of replacement pilots entering frontline service on the two sides. American training hours increased as the war went on, fed by expanding facilities, more aircraft, more fuel, and the systematic incorporation of combat lessons. Japanese training hours decreased, cut by fuel shortages, by the diversion of training aircraft to operational units, by the loss of experienced instructors, and by the growing urgency of filling slots in carrier air groups faster than the full program required. The Marianas turkey shoot was not an accident. It was the mathematical result of this divergence, accumulated over 2 years, arriving at its logical conclusion on a single morning in June of 1944. Ozawa's carriers had faced a second catastrophe on June 19 that the air battle numbers alone do not capture. While the air battle was destroying his aircraft above, American submarines were killing his carriers below. At 08:19 that morning, the submarine Albacore had fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the Taiho, the flagship, the newest and most powerful carrier in the Japanese fleet, commissioned only 3 months earlier and believed by Japanese planners to be essentially unsinkable due to her armored flight deck and reinforced hull. 1 torpedo hit. A single torpedo hit on a well-designed, properly handled carrier was survivable. The damage control procedures existed. The crew knew them. What happened next on Taiho was not a failure of the ship's design but a failure of damage control knowledge and decision-making. The kind of failure that becomes more likely when experienced officers have been replaced by less experienced ones. An inexperienced damage control officer, attempting to clear aviation fuel vapors from a ruptured fuel system, ordered the ventilation system open to flush fumes from the ship. The order was precisely wrong. Instead of clearing the fumes, it spread them through the enclosed spaces of the carrier, creating a volatile mixture that eventually found an ignition source. At approximately 1500 hours, Taiho exploded from within. She sank within minutes. Ozawa had to be physically transferred from his sinking flagship to a cruiser to continue directing the battle. Earlier that same morning, the submarine Kavala had torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, a ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and 2 years of hard fighting. 3 torpedoes struck her. She sank in the afternoon, taking with her a significant portion of an experienced air group and the institutional memory of a carrier that had been in continuous operation since before the war began. 2 fleet carriers, sunk by submarines on the same day their air groups were being destroyed overhead. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had been paying attention. Japanese carrier design, which prioritized offensive capability and speed over survivability and damage control, continued to extract its penalty in the conditions the war had actually created rather than the conditions the designers had planned for. The enclosed hangar decks that had magnified the bomb damage at Midway. The fuel systems that turned survivable torpedo hits into catastrophic explosions. The damage control doctrine delegated to line officers rather than specialist teams. These were not new problems. They were the same problems, reappearing in different ships, because the systemic failures that produced them had not been corrected. What had changed since Midway was the scale of American capability being brought to bear against them. Admiral Spruance's decision to hold the Fifth Fleet in a defensive posture rather than pursue Ozawa's retreating forces on the evening of June 19 provoked sharp criticism from officers who felt that a more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed more Japanese ships. Spruance himself acknowledged the criticism and accepted it as fair in the limited sense that an opportunity had been missed to extend the damage. What his critics sometimes underemphasized was what the defensive battle had actually accomplished. The Japanese carrier air groups, not just the aircraft but the trained human beings inside them, had been essentially destroyed as a coherent fighting force in a single day's combat. Of the approximately 430 aircraft that Ozawa had launched in his 4 waves, fewer than 100 returned to his carriers. The pilots who did not return were not merely equipment losses. They were the irreplaceable product of a training system that had already been operating beyond its sustainable capacity. Japan could build more aircraft, however slowly, could not replace the pilots, however urgently. The training pipeline that fed carrier aviation had been running at deficit for 2 years. The Philippine Sea emptied it. The post-war interrogations of Japanese naval officers by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey produced candid assessments that, read carefully, reveal how thoroughly the Japanese High Command had understood their pilot quality problem and how completely they had failed to solve it. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, who had served as Chief of Staff to the Combined Fleet and later commanded air forces in the Philippines, was direct. Losses of trained pilots, he told American interrogators, were the decisive factor in Japan's air power decline. He described the dilemma explicitly. The operational demand for experienced pilots was always immediate and always took priority over the training need. There was never a moment when commanders in the field felt they could spare their best men for rear area assignments. The result was that the training system, deprived of its most essential resource, experienced instructors with current combat knowledge, produced graduates who were technically functional but tactically deficient. They could take off and land on a carrier deck. They could navigate. They could find a target and deliver their weapons. What they could not reliably do was survive the hostile environment they encountered when American fighters intercepted them. Rear Admiral Suyo Obayashi, who commanded a carrier division at the Philippine Sea, described the experience of watching his air groups depart and not return in terms that were almost clinical in their detachment, as though the emotional content had been processed into something harder to hold. He knew before they launched that the odds were unfavorable. He launched them anyway because the operational plan required it, because turning back was not an option the command structure permitted, and because the institutional commitment to the AGO operation had passed the point where individual assessments of pilot readiness could change the course of events. Commander Masate Kokumiya, an air staff officer who served throughout the war and survived it, published an account in 1956 that remains one of the most honest Japanese assessments of the pilot quality problem. He described the 1944 replacement pilots as simply not equipped, in hours or experience, for the combat environment they entered. He used language that the official reports never used, words that acknowledged not the spiritual failure that Japanese doctrine blamed when things went wrong, but the concrete, material failure of a training system that had been asked to produce more than it could deliver. What none of these officers addressed directly, and what the interrogation records suggest they found genuinely difficult to articulate, was the corollary question. If Japanese pilots by 1944 were underprepared, what did that imply about American pilots? The institutional answer, carried forward from the pre-war assessments through Midway and the Solomons and into the Philippine Sea, had been that American pilots were technically competent but spiritually inferior. They could fly and fight, but they lacked the depth of commitment, the willingness to die without hesitation, the subordination of individual survival to collective mission, that Japanese doctrine identified as the decisive variable in aerial combat. The Marianas Turkey shoot ended that argument permanently. Not because American pilots had demonstrated unusual willingness to die, they had not been required to, which was itself a statement about the tactical situation, but because they had demonstrated something the doctrine had not assigned them: complete, comprehensive, systematic superiority at every level of the engagement. They had known where the enemy was before the enemy knew they were there. They had been positioned correctly with altitude and speed when the engagement began. They had executed their tactics with discipline and precision under combat conditions. They had maintained formation integrity under stress. They had made correct decisions in the chaos of a large-scale air battle. And they had come home, most of them, because the aircraft they were flying was better than the aircraft trying to kill them, and because the training that had put them in those aircraft had prepared them for exactly this. The spiritual calculus that Japanese doctrine had insisted upon was not just wrong. It had never been the right question. The broader picture of American pilot development in the Pacific War is one of the most significant institutional achievements of the conflict, and it is one that received far less attention in the immediate post-war period than the industrial production story. The production story was easier to tell. Ships, tanks, aircraft, numbers that could be tabulated and compared. 5,500 SBD Dauntless, 12,000 Hellcats, 24 Essex-class carriers. The sheer scale of American manufacturing was a story that wrote itself, and it was a true story. What it obscured was the human story running alongside it. The story of the Naval Aviation Training Command processing tens of thousands of candidates through a selection and training pipeline that was itself being continuously improved as the war produced new information about what combat actually required. The story of carrier air groups cycling between combat and training commands, carrying lessons forward and backward along the pipeline. The story of individual officers who recognized early that the gap between what training produced and what combat demanded had to be closed by design rather than by attrition. Commander John Thatch, who had developed the defensive weave at Midway and survived to teach it to thousands of students, spent 1943 as an instructor and planner before returning to command. His contributions to American tactical doctrine, not just the weave itself but the broader framework of how to fight against a more maneuverable opponent, were incorporated into the training curriculum that produced the pilots who fought at the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Edward Faitner, who flew in the Solomons campaign and survived, returned to training command and helped revise the gunnery syllabus based on what he had observed in actual combat. The angle at which you approached a zero mattered. The range at which you opened fire mattered. The instinct to follow a target through its maneuver mattered, because it put you in a predictable flight path that an enemy wingman could exploit. These were lessons that could not be derived from a training syllabus written in peacetime. They had to be extracted from combat experience and deliberately injected back into the system. The Japanese pilot who launched from Ozawa's carriers in June of 1944 had received instruction from men who had not seen combat recently enough for their knowledge to be current, flying aircraft whose characteristics they had not fully mastered, against an enemy whose capabilities their training had not accurately modeled. The American pilot who intercepted him had been taught by veterans, in an aircraft designed partly in response to direct combat analysis of the aircraft he was fighting, executing tactics that had been developed and refined through 2 years of actual engagements. This was not luck. It was not fate. It was the cumulative result of thousands of organizational decisions made at every level of the American military system, from the Pensacola Training Command to the Bureau of Aeronautics to the Carrier Air Group commanders who had insisted on feeding their combat experience back into the pipeline. The final accounting of the Battle of the Philippine Sea extended beyond the air battle of June 19th. On the evening of June 20th, American search aircraft located Ozawa's retreating fleet at extreme range. Admiral Spruance authorized a strike despite the distance. Pilots would have to fly the return leg in darkness, over open ocean with minimal fuel reserves. It was a decision that carried obvious risks. 216 aircraft launched from the American carriers in the late afternoon. They found Ozawa's fleet as the sun was setting. The carrier Hyo was sunk by torpedo bombers. 2 fleet carriers were damaged. 2 fleet oilers were destroyed. Ozawa's screening forces suffered additional losses. The return flight was the kind of ordeal that tested everything the American training program had built. Pilots navigating by instruments in darkness, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, searching for carriers that were blacked out against submarine attack. Spruance, recognizing the situation, made the decision to turn on the fleet's lights, a significant tactical risk, to guide his pilots home. Approximately 80 aircraft were lost on the return. Most of them ditched in the water when fuel ran out. The rescue operation that followed was extraordinarily effective. Of the approximately 160 pilots and aircrew who went down, about 100 were recovered by destroyers operating through the night and into the following morning. The willingness to risk the fleet to recover those men, the organizational and moral commitment to not leaving pilots in the water, was itself an expression of the doctrine that had made the American air campaign successful. Pilots who knew they would be rescued if they went down flew differently from pilots who knew they would not be. They pressed their attacks with a confidence that was not merely psychological but rational, grounded in a realistic assessment of what the system around them would do if things went wrong. It was, in its way, the opposite of the Japanese approach, which valorized the willingness to die but had built fewer structures for keeping men alive. The Japan that Vice Admiral Ozawa brought back to port after the Philippine Sea was not the Japan that had sortied toward Midway 2 years earlier, confident in its pilots and its carriers and its assessment of American weakness. It was a Navy that had expended its carrier air groups for the second time in 2 years, that had confirmed, beyond the possibility of institutional denial, that the quality of American pilots was not what the pre-war assessments had calculated, that had discovered, in the most brutal classroom available, that technical competence and tactical doctrine and organizational design produced a form of fighting effectiveness that spiritual commitment could not substitute for. What came next, the kamikaze program, the organized use of suicide attacks that Japan initiated later in 1944, is sometimes read as an expression of Japanese martial culture, a final assertion of the spiritual values that doctrine had always privileged over material ones. That reading is not entirely wrong, but it is also a practical confession. The kamikaze program was adopted in part because conventional attacks by conventionally trained pilots had become so ineffective against American defenses that the only way to guarantee a hit was to attach the pilot to the bomb. Japan had built its air power philosophy on the belief that the right kind of pilot, trained to the right standard, imbued with the right spirit, could overcome any material disadvantage. By the autumn of 1944, the program designed to produce that pilot was in ruins. The veterans were gone. The training hours had been cut to levels that senior officers privately acknowledged were insufficient. The aircraft were outmatched. The kamikaze was, in its terrible way, the endpoint of the logic. If trained pilots could not win, perhaps untrained ones aimed directly at the target could accomplish something. It was not a doctrine of confidence. It was a doctrine of desperation wearing the clothes of sacrifice. The story of what Japanese commanders really thought about American pilots is ultimately a story about the relationship between institutional belief and institutional reality, about how large organizations build their understanding of the enemy, and what happens when that understanding is wrong. The Japanese assessment was not irrational at the point it was formed. In the 1930s, the evidence available to Japanese intelligence genuinely supported skepticism about American air power. American training was underfunded. American equipment was often inferior. The American military culture that Japanese observers could see was not the one that fought at Midway or the Philippine Sea. It was an earlier, peacetime version that had not yet been tested. What Japanese planners failed to incorporate was the American capacity for adaptation. Not just industrial adaptation, the factories running 3 shifts, the shipyards working around the clock, the production lines building carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers, but institutional adaptation. The willingness to look honestly at what was going wrong and change it. The willingness to build feedback loops between combat and training. The willingness to treat pilot survival as an organizational asset rather than a spiritual variable. McCluskey turning northwest over an empty ocean because the mission had to be completed. Dick Best banking away from Kaga with 2 wingmen because doctrine was right and the crowd was wrong. The rear gunners in the back seats of those dauntless who could not control their fate and trusted the men in front of them. The mechanics who armed the bombs in pre-dawn darkness and sent those planes into the air on the accuracy of their work. The codebreakers in their basement who gave Nimitz the information he needed. All of these men, from Midway to the Philippine Sea, were part of a system that learned. That is what Japanese commanders ultimately failed to account for. Not the courage of individual Americans, they had seen that courage at Midway and measured it fairly. Not the quality of individual aircraft, the Dauntless was slow and the Wildcat was inferior to the Zero and they knew it. What they failed to account for was the system. A system that took the lessons of Midway and built them into every Hellcat pilot who flew at the Philippine Sea. A system that took the sacrifice of Waldron's torpedo squadron and made sure the next generation of pilots understood why those men had died and what their deaths had purchased. A system that refused to accept that the enemy it was fighting was defined by the equipment and performance it had shown in its worst moments, and kept working until it produced something better. At 10:25 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Dick Best's single bomb had struck Akagi amidships and changed the arithmetic of the Pacific War. 2 years later, the pilots who descended on Ozawa's fleet in the Philippine Sea were the inheritors of what that bomb had purchased. Not just the time it had bought for American industry to mobilize, but the institutional lesson it had delivered, absorbed, and acted upon. The Japanese had believed American pilots were soft. They had believed American spirit was insufficient. They had believed, to the end, that something essential in the American character made American aviators less than what the moment required. In the 5 minutes over Midway, and in the long terrible morning above the Philippine Sea, American pilots had answered that belief with the only argument that matters in war. The world Japan had built its confidence upon did not survive the answer. If the story of courage, miscalculation, and the human cost of institutional arrogance stayed with you, please subscribe and leave a comment below. Stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them.